President Rachel Stone stood at the window of her office on Earth and looked out at the construction crews building new orbital shipyards above the planet. 1 year had passed since humanity withdrew from the Galactic Council, and human civilization was growing stronger every day. Without council restrictions holding them back, humans were expanding faster than ever before. The irony was not lost on her. The aliens had voted to limit human development because they feared humanity was becoming too powerful. Now that humanity was free from those limits, they were becoming more powerful than the aliens had ever imagined possible. Captain Mike Davis guided his merchant ship through the debris field that had once been a Krellian trade station and tried not to look too closely at the bodies floating among the wreckage. The Krellian Empire and the Dorthak Federation had been fighting for 6 months now, and no one was left to negotiate peace between them. Human peacekeepers had always handled that job, but humans were no longer available. Mike's ship carried medical supplies and food for refugee camps on the border worlds, but he had to be careful about being seen. Officially, humanity maintained complete neutrality in alien conflicts. Unofficially, some human merchants were making good money selling supplies to desperate species who had nowhere else to turn. The black market trade was growing every week. Alien governments still refused to formally request human assistance, but private companies and individuals were paying enormous prices for human technology and expertise. Mike had heard of human doctors charging 1 million credits for simple surgeries, and human engineers demanding planetary mining rights for basic repairs. He felt bad about profiting from alien suffering, but business was business. The aliens had chosen to reject humanity, and now they were learning what that choice cost. Dr. Karen Miller reviewed her research notes in her laboratory on Mars and tried to make sense of the data she was collecting about the galactic crisis. As the leading expert on alien societies, she had been tasked with documenting the collapse of Council civilization for future historical analysis. The numbers were staggering. Economic output in Council space had dropped by 40%. Medical services had declined to pre-space age levels in many regions. Transportation networks were failing as navigation systems went unmaintained. Industrial production was grinding to a halt as complex machinery broke down. But the most interesting data concerned the psychological impact of the crisis. Alien societies that had dominated the galaxy for thousands of years were discovering that they were not as self-sufficient as they had believed. Species that had never experienced serious hardship were panicking when faced with problems they could not solve. Karen had predicted this outcome in her academic papers years ago, but no one had listened. She had warned that the galaxy was becoming too dependent on human contributions, and that sudden withdrawal could cause systemic collapse. The alien leadership had dismissed her warnings as human arrogance. Now her predictions were coming true, with frightening accuracy. Chairman Zethkar sat in his private chambers on Velthari Prime and stared at the latest reports from across his empire. Food riots in the agricultural colonies, power failures in the industrial centers, medical emergencies that could not be treated properly. His advisors kept telling him that the problems were temporary, but Zethkar was beginning to suspect that they were lying. The Velthari had always prided themselves on being the most advanced species in the galaxy. Their technology was sophisticated and their culture was ancient and their military was powerful, but somehow they could not manage to keep their space stations running or their hospitals functioning without human assistance. It made no sense. Humans were a young species who had barely learned to travel between stars. How could such primitive beings be so essential to galactic civilization? How had the mighty Velthari become dependent on creatures they considered little better than clever animals? Zethkar had voted for Resolution 2847X because he believed humanity needed to be controlled before they became a threat to the established order. Now he was beginning to wonder if humanity had already become more powerful than anyone realized. Maybe driving them away had not eliminated the threat, but had simply made it worse. His military advisors reported that human space was expanding rapidly in all directions. Human colonies were being established in regions that had been considered too dangerous or too remote for settlement. Human ships were exploring beyond the edges of known space and making contact with species that had never been part of the galactic community. Without council restrictions, humanity was free to grow as fast and as far as they wanted. In a few decades, they might be strong enough to challenge the entire galaxy. Refugee coordinator Nalseth struggled to manage the flood of displaced persons arriving at the emergency camps on Sanctuary Station. 15 species had formally seceded from the Galactic Council in the past month, and millions of their citizens were fleeing the chaos in their home systems. The station had been designed to handle a few thousand refugees from local conflicts, but now it was trying to shelter nearly 1 million beings from across the galaxy. Food supplies were running low and medical facilities were overwhelmed, and the life support systems were operating beyond safe limits. Nalseth had sent desperate requests for assistance to every major power in the galaxy, but most were too busy dealing with their own problems to help. The Velthari claimed they had no resources to spare. The Krellians were focused on their war with the Dorthax. The Thexni offered sympathy but no actual aid. Everyone knew that human relief organizations could solve the refugee crisis in a matter of weeks. Human ships could transport millions of people safely, and human medical teams could treat any injury or disease. Human engineers could expand the station's capacity, and human diplomats could negotiate resettlement agreements. But humanity was no longer part of the galactic community. They had been driven away by species who thought they could manage perfectly, well, without human interference. Now those same species were learning how wrong they had been. Captain Davis completed his delivery to the refugee camps and prepared to depart for human space. As his ship lifted away from Sanctuary Station, he could see more refugee transports arriving in the distance. The crisis was getting worse every day, and there was no end in sight. His cargo hold was now full of alien artwork and precious metals, and rare elements that desperate species were trading for human supplies. Some of the items were priceless cultural artifacts that should have been in museums, but their owners were willing to sell anything to buy food and medicine for their people. Davis felt guilty about taking advantage of the situation, but he reminded himself that humanity had not started this crisis. The aliens had voted to exclude humanity from the galactic community, and now they were facing the consequences of that decision. If they wanted human help, they could ask for it officially. They could admit that they had made a mistake and negotiate a new relationship based on mutual respect instead of condescension. But their pride would not let them take that step. So the crisis would continue and more species would suffer, and the galaxy would keep falling apart until someone finally swallowed their pride and did what needed to be done. President Stone received the latest intelligence reports from her advisors and felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Humanity was thriving in isolation, but the rest of the galaxy was collapsing into chaos. Part of her wanted to help, but another part remembered how humanity had been treated by species who considered them inferior and dangerous. The aliens had made their choice. Now they would have to live with the consequences. Dr. Miller published her research findings in the Journal of Xenosociology and wondered if anyone in alien space would read them. Her analysis showed that the galactic crisis was only going to get worse until fundamental changes were made to how species interacted with each other. The old system of established powers controlling younger species had been broken by humanity's withdrawal. Something new would have to take its place, but that would require admitting that the old ways had failed. Whether the aliens could swallow their pride enough to do that remained to be seen. Director Sam Hughes stood in the command center of Earth's Colonial Coordination Office and watched the largest evacuation in human history unfold on 1,000 screens. Red dots marked human settlements and green lines showed evacuation routes, and blue squares indicated pickup points. Every few seconds, another dot would blink and disappear as another human outpost went dark. The operation had a simple name. They called it Going Home. In 3 weeks, humanity would remove every person and every piece of equipment from council space. No human would remain to serve alien masters or beg for permission to exist. Captain Nicole Parker guided her cargo ship New Horizon through the shipping lanes around Velthari Prime and tried not to think about the friends she was leaving behind. Her crew had worked these routes for 8 years, and they knew every station master and dock worker and customs official in the sector. The Velthari had always been difficult, but some of them were decent people who just wanted to do their jobs and feed their families. Nicole's cargo hold carried medical supplies and agricultural equipment that the Velthari needed desperately. Their crops had been failing for 2 seasons and their hospitals were running out of basic medicines. The supplies in her ship could save thousands of lives. She delivered them anyway. Orders were orders, and Captain Parker always followed orders. But when the Velthari dock supervisor asked about next month's delivery, she just shook her head. This is the last one. Humanity is pulling out of Council space. The supervisor's mandibles clicked in confusion. But who will supply the medicine for the children's hospitals? Nicole did not answer because she did not know. That was not humanity's problem anymore. Engineer Tom Bradley crawled through the maintenance tunnels under Kepler Station and carefully removed every human-designed component he could carry. The station had been built by 6 different species over 2 centuries, but the really important parts were human engineering. The quantum resonance stabilizers that kept the artificial gravity working smoothly, the atmospheric processors that mixed air for dozens of different species, the computer cores that ran traffic control for the busiest shipping junction in the galaxy. Tom had designed half of these systems himself and trained alien engineers to maintain them. But human technology came with human support, and when the humans left, the technology would start breaking down. Maybe the aliens could figure out how to fix things. Maybe they could not. Tom did not plan to stick around and find out. His apprentice, Kesatari, found him in Tunnel 7 removing a backup power coupling. The young alien had been working with Tom for 3 years and was probably the best student he had ever taught. Master Bradley, why are you taking the equipment away? Did someone steal something? Tom looked at the eager face of his apprentice and felt something twist in his chest. Kesatari had worked so hard to learn human engineering, and now it would all be wasted. Humanity is leaving Council space. I have to remove our technology. But the station will not work properly without these components. I know. People could die if the atmospheric processors fail. I know. Tom finished disconnecting the coupling and handed Kesatari his toolkit. You are a good engineer. Maybe you can figure out how to build replacements. He left Kesatari holding the tools and crawled deeper into the tunnels. There were 50 more components to remove before his transport left in the morning. Dr. Amy Walsh supervised the evacuation of the human medical facility on Thexney Station 7 and tried not to look at the patients in the waiting area. Dozens of aliens sat or stood or floated in whatever passed for anxiety among their species. They had traveled light years to reach the only hospital in 3 sectors that could treat cross-species infections. The Thexney doctors were skilled, but they specialized in their own biology. Human doctors had spent decades learning how to treat dozens of different alien species and developing medicines that worked across genetic barriers. The hospital had saved millions of lives over the years. Amy's staff packed equipment and sealed medical samples and destroyed research notes that took decades to develop. Everything with human fingerprints had to go. The alien staff watched in growing panic as irreplaceable technology disappeared into shipping containers. Dr. Yethmar of the Thexney approached Amy as she supervised the packing of the quantum medical scanner. Dr. Walsh, surely you cannot remove this equipment. We have patients who will die without it. Amy looked at the scanner that had cost humanity 50 billion credits and 20 years of research to develop. The Council voted to restrict human technology. This scanner uses restricted human technology. But these are sick children in the pediatric ward. Then maybe the Council should have thought about that before they voted. Amy sealed the shipping container and walked away. Behind her, she could hear Dr. Yethmar trying to explain to worried families that their children would have to find treatment somewhere else. Admiral Lisa Carter reviewed the withdrawal reports from her office in the Human Embassy and felt proud of how smoothly everything was going. In just 3 weeks, humanity had evacuated 2 million civilians and removed 30 trillion credits worth of equipment and technology. Not one human had been left behind, and not one piece of critical technology had fallen into alien hands. The aliens were starting to panic now. Food shipments had stopped when human cargo companies ceased operations. Medical emergencies were going untreated as human doctors and nurses returned home. Industrial projects ground to a halt as human engineers and technicians disappeared. Peace talks collapsed when human mediators withdrew from conflict zones. Some alien leaders were calling for emergency sessions to discuss the crisis. Others insisted that the aliens were better off without human interference. Most just seemed confused about why their perfect galaxy was suddenly falling apart. Admiral Carter's aide brought her the latest intelligence reports. Trade volume in Council space had dropped 30% in just 2 weeks. 3 minor wars had restarted without human peacekeepers to keep the sides separated. The Council Treasury was projecting massive budget shortfalls now that human tax contributions had ended. Carter read the reports and felt no satisfaction. Humanity had not wanted this fight. They had tried for 50 years to be good galactic citizens and helpful neighbors. The other species had thrown that friendship away for the sake of their own pride and fear. The withdrawal ships were already loading for the journey home. Soon there would be no humans left in Council space except for the diplomatic observers who would stay behind to monitor the situation. Humanity would return to its own star systems and build its own future, without asking permission from species who saw them as dangerous children. Captain Parker docked her ship at the last human station in Council space and watched other evacuation ships arrive and depart in careful coordination. Everyone knew their jobs and everyone did their part. No arguments or complaints or second thoughts. When humanity decided to do something, they did it completely. The station commander announced that the last civilian transport would depart in 6 hours. After that, only military vessels would remain to cover the final withdrawal. Nicole looked out at the galaxy that had been humanity's home for 50 years and wondered if they would ever come back. Probably not. When humans made a decision, they usually stuck with it. The galaxy had made its choice, and now humanity would make theirs. The stars looked exactly the same as they always had, but somehow everything felt different now. Administrator Paul Green watched the emergency lights flash red across the main display board in Nexus Prime's control center and wondered how long it would take for everything to completely break down. 6 months had passed since humanity withdrew from the Galactic Council, and the cracks in civilization were spreading faster than anyone had expected. Paul had stayed behind as an independent observer when the other humans left. His job was to monitor the situation and report back to Earth about how the aliens were managing without human assistance. The answer was simple. They were not managing at all. The atmospheric recycling system had failed again this morning, and Paul could smell the stale air getting worse by the hour. The Velthari technicians stood around the broken machinery looking confused and arguing about which parts needed replacement. They had documentation that explained everything in detail, but somehow they could not make the repairs work properly. Paul knew why. Human engineers had designed the system to be maintained by humans who understood human thinking patterns. The aliens could follow the instructions, but they could not adapt when something unexpected happened. They needed someone to show them how to think through problems the way humans did. Maintenance Chief Linda Roberts was the last human technician on the station, and she spent her days running from one crisis to another. The aliens begged her to fix things, but she had strict orders not to interfere. She could only observe and document what happened when the infrastructure began to collapse. Linda found Paul in the observation deck overlooking the main reactor chamber, where Thexany engineers were trying to replace a burned-out power coupling. They had been working for 3 days and had made the problem worse. They installed the coupling backwards, and now they are afraid to touch it again. The backup systems are running at 90% capacity. Paul made a note on his tablet. How long before we have a complete power failure? Maybe 2 weeks if they keep making mistakes like this. Maybe less. Through the observation window, they could see the Thexany engineers holding another conference about what to do next. Their movements looked nervous and uncertain. These were skilled professionals who had maintained starships and space stations for centuries, but human technology was different from what they were used to working with. Commander Alex Johnson monitored alien communication networks from a hidden listening post in the asteroid belt and forwarded the most interesting intercepts to Earth intelligence. The aliens were starting to panic, but most of them still refused to admit that they needed human help. The Velthari government had issued a statement claiming that minor technical difficulties were normal during transition periods. The Krellian Empire insisted that their superior military technology made them independent of human assistance. The Thexny Assembly voted to increase funding for research into replacing human innovations with native alternatives. But in the classified communications that Alex intercepted, the story was very different. Military commanders complained about navigation systems failing without human maintenance. Medical officers reported rising death rates as human-designed equipment broke down. Trade officials warned about economic collapse as shipping routes became unreliable. Alex compiled the intelligence reports and transmitted them to Earth through quantum channels that the aliens could not detect. Humanity needed to know how bad things were getting and how long it might take for the aliens to swallow their pride and ask for help. Some species were suffering more than others. The smaller civilizations that had depended heavily on human aid were facing real disasters. The Dorthak Federation was dealing with another plague outbreak without human medical assistance. The mining colonies in the Kepler sector were running out of food because human cargo ships no longer delivered supplies. But the major powers still acted like everything was under control. They had too much pride to admit that they had made a mistake by driving humanity away. Senator Yithmar of the Velthari walked through the corridors of the government complex on Velthari Prime and tried to ignore the smell of recycled air that was not quite clean enough. The atmospheric processors were working at 60% efficiency and getting worse every day. The human engineers who designed them had tried to train Velthari replacements, but the training had never been completed. Yithmar had been one of the few senators who voted against Resolution 2847X, and now she was watching her predictions come true. The Velthari economy was contracting as trade with human space ended. Industrial production was falling as human-maintained equipment broke down. Even the food supply was threatened because Velthari agriculture depended on human-developed fertilizers. She had called for emergency sessions to discuss reaching out to humanity. But the other senators refused to listen. They said the problems were temporary and that Velthari ingenuity would solve everything. They said admitting mistakes would make the government look weak. Yithmar knew better. Every day the problems got worse, and every day it became harder to fix them. Soon the Velthari would face a choice between their pride and their survival. Ambassador Kilrun floated in his biosuit in the empty corridors of the Galactic Council building and remembered when these halls had been full of diplomats and staff, working to solve the galaxy's problems. Now most of the offices were dark and the few remaining employees looked worried and uncertain. The council was broke. Human tax contributions had provided 40% of the budget, and now that money was gone. 3 emergency sessions had been called to discuss the crisis, but no one could agree on solutions. Some species wanted to increase their own contributions, but others refused to pay more. Some wanted to cut services, but others needed those services to survive. Quilran had tried to organize a delegation to approach humanity about returning to the Council, but the major powers blocked every attempt. They insisted that humanity would crawl back on its own when it realized how much it needed galactic civilization. But the reports from human space told a different story. Human colonies were thriving in isolation. Human trade networks were expanding into unexplored regions. Human technology was advancing rapidly without Council restrictions. Humanity did not seem to miss the galaxy at all. The old Thexnite diplomat had lived through many crises in his long career, but this one felt different. Previous problems had been caused by external threats or natural disasters. This crisis was self-inflicted and getting worse every day, because no one wanted to admit they had made a mistake. Paul Green filed his daily report to Earth and attached the latest sensor readings from around Nexus Prime. Power output was down 15% from the previous week. Water recycling efficiency had dropped to dangerous levels. The main computer core was showing signs of cascading system failures. He estimated that Nexus Prime would become uninhabitable within 6 months if current trends continued. The aliens were working desperately to fix the problems, but they were fighting a losing battle against technology they did not fully understand. Other reports from human observers throughout Council space painted similar pictures. Infrastructure breaking down, medical systems failing, trade networks collapsing, military readiness declining as equipment went unmaintained. The galaxy that had voted to restrict humanity was discovering what restriction really meant. Linda Roberts, made her final inspection of the atmospheric processing center, and shook her head at what she saw. The Velthari technicians had given up trying to repair the primary systems, and were now just trying to keep the backup units running. It was like using band-aids to fix a broken dam. Tomorrow she would board the last human transport off Nexus Prime. After that, the aliens would be completely on their own. She wondered how long the station would last without any human technical support. Probably not long. The aliens were smart and skilled, but they had become too dependent on human problem-solving methods. When something broke, they looked for humans to fix it instead of learning to fix it themselves. Now there were no humans left to call. The great assembly chamber stretched out like a metal ocean under the artificial stars of Nexus Prime. Captain Jake Morrison sat in the human delegation section and watched 847 species gather for what everyone called the most important vote in galactic history. The air recyclers hummed quietly as thousands of different breathing apparatus mixed oxygen with methane and sulfur compounds and strange gases that Jake could not even pronounce. Jake had served as the human representative for 20 years now, and he knew every face in this chamber. The tall blue Velthari with their crystal crowns sat in the front rows like they owned the place. The ancient Thexni floated in their biosuits near the center, speaking in whispers that sounded like wind through dead leaves. The warrior Krellians stood at attention in their powered armor, even though weapons were banned in the chamber. Admiral Lisa Carter leaned forward in the seat next to Jake, and her face looked tired. She had been fighting this vote for 6 months now, and Jake could see that she knew they were going to lose. Behind them sat Dr. Kevin Brooks, who had spent 15 years studying alien cultures and building bridges between species. His hands shook slightly as he held the tablet containing Resolution 2847X. The resolution had a long, fancy name, but everyone knew what it really meant. The other species wanted to put limits on human military development and expansion. They said humans were too aggressive and too unpredictable for a young species. They said humans needed guidance from older, wiser civilizations. They said it was for the good of the galaxy. Jake knew the real reason, though. Humans had joined the Galactic Council only 50 years ago, but they had already become too important. Human ships carried food to starving worlds when the transport unions went on strike. Human doctors worked in refugee camps on planets where other species refused to go. Human engineers fixed problems that had existed for centuries because they looked at things differently. Human peacekeepers stood between warring species and took bullets and plasma blasts meant for others. The other species did not like this. They called it showing off. They said humans were trying to make themselves look good by making others look bad. Some species had been part of the council for thousands of years, and they did not want to admit that the newcomers might be better at some things. Chairman Zeth Carr of the Velthari stood up, and his crystal crown caught the chamber lights. His voice echoed through the translation systems in hundreds of languages. We gather today to vote on Resolution 2847X, which will establish proper guidelines for emerging species military capabilities and territorial expansion. This measure ensures galactic stability and prevents dangerous escalation by species who lack the wisdom that comes with age. Jake almost laughed at that. The Velthari had started 3 wars in the last century. The Thexni had let entire star systems die from plague because helping would have cost too much money. The Krellians still practiced slavery and called it cultural tradition, but humans were the dangerous ones. Ambassador Quilron of the Thexni rose from his biosuit, and his ancient voice carried sadness. Before we vote, I must remind this assembly that humanity contributes 60% of our humanitarian aid budget and provides 40% of our peacekeeping forces. Perhaps we should consider what we risk losing. A chorus of angry clicks and whistles and electronic sounds filled the chamber. The other species did not want to hear about human contributions. They had convinced themselves that they were doing humans a favor by letting them be part of the council. The vote began. Species after species pressed their voting crystals, and the results appeared on the great display: green for yes and red for no and amber for abstention. Jake watched the numbers climb, and his heart sank. 623 green lights, 224 red lights, 0 amber. The resolution passed. Chairman Zeth Carr smiled. and his crystal crown sparkled. "The measure is approved. Humanity will comply with the new restrictions within 1 galactic standard year." Jake stood up slowly. The chamber fell silent as thousands of eyes and optical sensors and echolocation devices focused on him. He had prepared a long speech about justice and fairness and the contributions humanity had made. He had planned to remind them about the Dorthak plague that human doctors had stopped, and the Kepler station disaster that human engineers had prevented, and the border wars that human peacekeepers had ended. Instead, he just nodded. "We understand. Humanity formally withdraws from the Galactic Council effective immediately." The silence stretched for 10 seconds, then laughter began. The Velthari clicked their mandibles in amusement. The Krellians roared with mechanical voices. Even some of the smaller species chittered and buzzed with what passed for humor among their kind. Jake gathered his papers and put them in his case. Admiral Carter stood beside him and her face showed no emotion. Dr. Brooks picked up the human cultural artifacts they had brought as gifts for the other species and left them on the table. Nobody would want them now. They walked toward the exit and their footsteps echoed in the sudden quiet. Other species watched them go and Jake could feel their eyes. Some looked amused, some looked confused. A few looked worried, but not many, as though. They reached the door. Jake heard Chairman Zethkar speak again. "Let them go. They will be back within a cycle begging for readmission. Humans cannot survive alone in the galaxy." Jake paused at the threshold but did not turn around. Behind him, he heard Admiral Carter whisper something that sounded like, "We will see about that." Then they stepped through the door and left the great assembly chamber forever. In the corridor outside, other human staff were already packing boxes and removing human artwork from the walls. Word had traveled fast, and everyone knew what needed to be done. The human embassy would be empty by the end of the day. Jake looked back one last time at the chamber where he had spent 20 years of his life trying to build something better. Through the transparent walls he could see the other species already returning to their normal business. They acted like nothing important had happened. They acted like they had just swatted an annoying insect. Maybe they would learn different. Maybe they would not. Either way, it was no longer humanity's problem. Admiral Ben Taylor stood on the bridge of the battleship Terra Nova and watched the alien fleet approach the border between human space and what used to be Council territory. 3 years had passed since humanity withdrew from the galactic community, and this was the largest group of aliens to visit human space since the Exodus began. The fleet was not military. Ben's sensors showed cargo ships and passenger transports and medical vessels flying under a dozen different flags. At the center of the formation was an old diplomatic courier that had seen better days. The whole group looked desperate and tired, like refugees fleeing a disaster, which was exactly what they were. The Galactic Council had officially dissolved 6 months ago after losing 70% of its member species. The great civilization that had ruled the galaxy for thousands of years had collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance and incompetence. What remained was a collection of struggling governments trying to hold their territories together, while everything fell apart around them. Admiral Taylor opened a communication channel to the alien fleet. "This is Admiral Taylor of the Human Defense Force. You are approaching the border of human space. State your business." The reply came from the diplomatic courier in the familiar translated voice of Ambassador Quilran. "Admiral Taylor, this is Ambassador Quilran representing the Coalition of Independent Worlds. We request permission to enter human space for emergency diplomatic talks." Ben had been expecting this visit for months. His intelligence reports showed that the Coalition represented about 40 species that had broken away from the old council structure and were trying to build something new. They were the moderates who had opposed Resolution 2847X and who had warned about the consequences of driving humanity away. "Permission granted, Ambassador. Follow the navigation beacons to Luna Station. A diplomatic team will meet you there." Diplomat Susan Wright reviewed her briefing materials in the conference room on Luna Station and tried to prepare for the most important negotiation in human history. The aliens were coming to ask for help, but they were also offering something that humanity had never been given before: respect. The Coalition proposal was simple in principle but complex in practice. They wanted to establish a new kind of galactic community based on equality between species, rather than domination by ancient powers. No species would have special privileges based on age or military strength. All members would contribute according to their abilities and receive benefits according to their needs. It sounded good in theory, but Susan knew that putting it into practice would be difficult. Too many species still believed that they were superior to others. Too many governments still thought that might made right. Too many leaders still could not admit when they were wrong. The alien delegation arrived at Luna Station in transports that showed signs of hasty repairs and emergency modifications. These were not the proud representatives of galactic powers that Susan was used to dealing with. These were survivors of a collapsed civilization who were desperate enough to try something completely different. Ambassador Quilran led the group into the conference room, and Susan was shocked by how much the old diplomat had aged in 3 years. His biosuit showed signs of wear, and his movements seemed tired and painful. The collapse of galactic civilization had taken a toll on everyone. Behind Quilran came representatives of species that Susan recognized from intelligence reports. Senator Yithmar of the Velthari looked nothing like the arrogant aristocrats who had voted to restrict humanity. Her crystal crown was cracked and her robes were patched, and her eyes showed the weight of watching her empire crumble. Most surprising was the presence of Zethkar, the former chairman of the Old Council. He wore simple clothes instead of his ceremonial regalia, and his proud bearing had been replaced by something that looked almost like humility. The mighty leader who had dismissed humanity as dangerous children was now begging for their help. Dr. Chris Henderson arrived at Luna Station with a team of emergency response specialists and medical supplies for the refugee ships that were still arriving at the border. The humanitarian crisis in former council space was getting worse every day, and humanity could not ignore the suffering, even if they maintained official neutrality. Chris had spent the last year coordinating unofficial aid efforts that operated in the gray areas between human policy and alien pride. Human doctors worked in refugee camps under false identities. Human engineers repaired critical infrastructure and disappeared before anyone could thank them. Human ships delivered supplies to disaster zones and left before local authorities could object. It was not enough to solve the crisis, but it was enough to keep millions of beings alive while their leaders figured out what to do next. Chris hoped that today's negotiations would lead to something more organized and effective. The talks began with Ambassador Quilran presenting the coalition's proposal for a new galactic organization. The Mutual Respect Accords would establish trade relationships and security cooperation between member species without the hierarchical structure that had doomed the old council. Susan listened carefully and asked detailed questions about how the new system would work in practice. She had been authorized to negotiate but not to commit humanity to anything without approval from Earth. The aliens were offering partnership, but humanity had learned to be careful about alien promises. Younger. Kesatari sat in the observation gallery and watched the negotiations with eyes that had seen too much suffering for someone so young. The former engineering apprentice had become a refugee coordinator when Kepler Station finally collapsed, and had spent 2 years helping other displaced beings find new homes. Kesatari represented a generation of aliens who had grown up during the collapse and who understood that the old ways of thinking about galactic politics were dead. These young beings did not care about ancient grudges or species superiority. They just wanted to build a future where everyone could live in peace. The negotiations continued for 3 days, with both sides working through complex details about trade agreements and security arrangements and humanitarian cooperation. The aliens were offering humans equal status in the new organization, but they were also asking for immediate assistance with the ongoing crisis. Susan could see that the alien representatives were sincere, but she also knew that sincerity was not enough. Too many promises had been broken in the past. Humanity would need concrete guarantees that they would be treated as equal partners, rather than junior members who could be discarded when convenient. Former Chairman Zethkar asked for a private meeting with Susan on the final day of talks. They met in a small conference room overlooking Earth, and for several minutes neither spoke. Finally, Zethkar broke the silence. "I owe humanity an apology. I believed that restricting your development would preserve galactic stability. I was wrong. Susan studied the alien leader who had once seemed so powerful and arrogant. What changed your mind? Watching my civilization collapse because we drove away the people who were holding it together. Seeing millions suffer because of decisions I supported. Learning that wisdom does not always come with age. Zethkar looked out at Earth through the observation window. I have heard that human space is thriving while the rest of the galaxy falls apart. You could have gloated about being proven right, but instead you are sending aid to people who rejected you. That shows a kind of strength that I am only beginning to understand. The negotiations concluded with a preliminary agreement that would need to be ratified by the human government and the coalition member species. Humanity would provide emergency assistance to address the humanitarian crisis in exchange for guaranteed equal representation in the new galactic organization. It was not everything the aliens had hoped for, but it was more than they had any right to expect. Humanity was offering a second chance to species that had thrown away their friendship out of fear and prejudice. Admiral Taylor watched the alien fleet depart from human space and wondered what the future would bring. The galaxy had learned a hard lesson about the cost of taking allies for granted, but whether that lesson would stick remained to be seen. Some species would accept the new partnership and work to build something better. Others would reject it and remain isolated in their pride and stubbornness. The galaxy would be divided into those who chose cooperation and those who chose continued conflict. Susan Wright transmitted her final report to Earth and recommended acceptance of the coalition proposal. Humanity had spent 3 years proving that they could thrive in isolation, but that did not mean isolation was the best choice for the future. The galaxy needed humanity, but humanity also needed the galaxy, not as masters and subjects, but as equals, working together to solve problems that no single species could handle alone. Dr. Henderson began organizing the humanitarian mission that would provide immediate relief to the worst affected areas in former Council space. It would be the largest aid operation in galactic history, and it would be carried out under the banner of the new Mutual Respect Accords. The old galaxy was dead, but something new was being born from its ashes. Whether that new civilization would be better than what came before would depend on whether all species could learn to treat each other with the respect that should have been given from the beginning.